The strange case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde has fascinated the world since its publication in 1886. Robert Louis Stevenson's original novella only runs to around 70 pages, but it has spawned countless adaptations, sequels, translations, reinventions and spoofs over the past 100 years, and almost as many interpretations of its central question. How can a fine, upstanding citizen, a pillar of the community, also be a murderous monster? Welcome to Insane History. I'm Professor Graeme Yorston, and today I'm exploring the strange world of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde to uncover what inspired Stevenson to create one of fiction's most enduring characters. And to find out who was the real Dr. Jekyll. Stevenson himself was an interesting character. Born in Edinburgh, yet destined to travel the world and end his days in the South Pacific. The son of a lighthouse engineer who trained to be a lawyer, but earned his living, very precariously at first, as a writer. Stevenson never had good health. At the time, it was thought his coughing and unnatural thinness was due to tuberculosis, and he spent time on the French Riviera, hoping the better weather would allow his lungs to heal. And it was in France he met Indianapolis-born Fanny van der Grift, 10 years his senior and married with children. Despite the obvious impediments, they fell in love, and deciding he couldn't be without her, he followed her out to California, where, after her divorce and a few scrapes along the way, they eventually married. Up to this point, Stevenson had been known primarily as an essayist and travel writer. But at the age of 30, after returning to Scotland, and inspired by his 12-year-old stepson's painting of an imaginary Caribbean isle, he began writing his children's pirate adventure, Treasure Island. Always looking for a better climate, he moved to the seaside town of Bournemouth, where he followed up the success of Treasure Island with Kidnapped and Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Not The Strange Case, but just Strange Case, a deliberate grammatical omission which adds to the sense of mystery. Stevenson had been brought up in a strict Scottish Presbyterian household, and all of his writing explores the nature of right and wrong, good and evil. While writing Kidnapped, itself a powerful moral tale, he had what he described as a financial fluctuation, and had to think of a way of earning some money quickly. At the time, shilling shockers were popular, cheaply produced murder stories for the great unwashed, focusing on all the lurid and gory details of crimes of passion. How hard could it be to dash off one of these? Harder than he first thought. Writing later, he describes how he racked his brain for days trying to come up with a plot, when, one night, suddenly, he awoke from a dream with the idea for Jekyll and Hyde. In 3 days of furious writing, he committed the story to paper. His stepson said he then came downstairs in a fever, read nearly half the book aloud, and then, while we were still gasping, he was away again, busy writing. But in response to a comment from his wife, he threw the first draft in the fire and frantically rewrote the whole thing in just a few more days. Although his 3 years in Bournemouth were some of the most productive in terms of writing, he was ill throughout this period, at times being confined to bed for weeks on end. His physician, Dr. Thomas Bodley Scott, tried everything including morphine to relieve his symptoms, and often forbade his patient to speak aloud for fear of precipitating one of his pulmonary hemorrhages. Stevenson described himself at this time as a pallid brute that lived in Skerrymoor, his house in Bournemouth, like a weevil in a biscuit. It seems likely that his doctor would also have tried him with a new wonder drug that physicians around the world were enthusiastically offering their patients as a cure for everything from the common cold, seasickness, hay fever, whooping cough, neuralgia, dysentery, asthma, syphilis, opium addiction, even sore nipples and vaginismus. And we know that Fanny was an avid reader of The Lancet, Britain's leading medical journal, which had an article on the use of the new wonder drug just a month before her husband wrote Jekyll and Hyde. So it is entirely possible she might have given Dr. Scott a nudge, even if he hadn't seen any of the articles himself. The name of the wonderful new drug on everyone's lips? Cocaine. So it is quite conceivable that Stevenson's colossal achievement of getting the 60,000 words of the first and second drafts onto paper in just 6 days was helped along not by the brownies or good-natured hobgoblins that come out at night to help with household chores he alludes to in his essay, but to an extract of an exotic South American shrub. The book was an instant success, selling 40,000 copies in its first 6 months. A stage adaptation appeared within a year, and the first movie by 1908. Barely a year has gone by since without some new rendition of the work appearing, and I was lucky enough to see a new one-man version in Edinburgh that still managed to find something fresh to say. So, we know quite a lot about how Stevenson wrote his novel, but who was it based on? What dark soul inspired him to create one of literature's most memorable characters? The name of Dr. Jekyll came from his friend, the Reverend Walter Jekyll, one-time canon of Worcester Cathedral, who lost his faith and went to Italy to learn to sing. But there doesn't seem to have been a Mr. Hyde facet to the good Reverend, who lived out his life in Jamaica, writing books on philosophy and Jamaican folk songs, and supporting local poets to publish their work. So, if it wasn't the benign Reverend Jekyll, who was the inspiration? There are two main candidates for the outwardly respectable member of society with an ungodly darker side. William Brodie, usually known by his title of Deacon Brodie, was a well-to-do 18th century Scottish cabinet maker. He was from an established family, president of the Incorporation of Rights and a councillor for the city of Edinburgh. But he also had a secret life as a gambler, rake and housebreaker. By day, Brodie was a respected craftsman and head of the family firm. He must have been highly regarded as he was elected by his peers as the president of the Guild of Carpenters, and as such he was known as Deacon, there being no religious connection to the title as is sometimes believed. The role gave him a seat on the council and allowed him to mix with the gentry and socialise with all of the intellectuals and artistic types of Enlightenment Edinburgh. He met the poet Robert Burns and the painter Henry Raeburn, and was a member of the convivial drinking society, the Edinburgh Cape Club. In his work as a cabinet maker, he would get to know his wealthy clients' houses, installing and repairing locks on doors, closets and strongboxes, and no doubt having a good look at what they had hidden away in their cupboards. At some point, he decided to start copying their keys by making wax impressions and begin a second career as a burglar. He needed the money as he had developed a bit of a gambling problem, throwing away his honestly and now his dishonestly gained earnings at a notorious tavern on Flesh Market Close. This narrow street was named not after what you might think, but because it was the centre of the city's meat trade, although Brodie probably indulged in trade of a different kind as well, as we know that he kept at least 2 mistresses and 5 illegitimate children in the old town. To assist him in his nefarious activities, he assembled a gang of miscreants. John Brown, a thief on the run from a 7-year sentence of transportation to the colonies. George Smith, an English locksmith who ran a grocer's shop in the Cowgate. And Andrew Ainsley, a shoemaker. And together they set about relieving Edinburgh's affluent elite of some of their wealth. Although Brodie's crimes were relatively low-key to begin with, his hunger increased, and he grew bolder and more willing to take risks. On one occasion, he copied the keys to a bank door and got away with £800, around $30,000 in today's money. But greed got the better of him. In 1788, he planned an armed raid on the excise office on Canongate. He had made a copy of the entry key using putty on an earlier visit and was able to simply unlock the door. Accompanied by his henchmen, all wearing black and armed with flintlock pistols, Brodie was in such high spirits that he was singing tunes from the Beggar's Opera, the bitingly satirical ballad opera that was incredibly popular at the time.
Through all the employments of life, each neighbour abuses his brother.
They went in around 8 p.m, expecting to be uninterrupted for 2 hours, as the night watchman did not normally come on until 10. But when someone returned to his office unexpectedly at 8:30, they had to make their escape with only £16. Brodie hurried home, changed into some more conventional clothes, and rushed off to the house of his mistress, Jean Watt, hoping she would provide an alibi. But Brown did not go home. He went to the authorities to ask for a king's pardon, offering them the names of Smith and Ainsley in return, and showing them the stash of duplicate keys hidden under a stone at the base of Salisbury Crags. At first, he said nothing about Brodie. Smith and Ainsley were arrested, and the next day Brodie unwisely attempted to visit them in the cells at the Tolbooth prison, but he was refused entry. Realising that it was only a matter of time before he was implicated, he fled Edinburgh and headed south, reaching the port of Dover 500 miles away in just 18 days. George Williamson, a king's messenger, was in hot pursuit, but he managed to evade him by backtracking to London. There, he managed to persuade the captain of a ship returning to Edinburgh to make a detour and drop him off in Vlissingen or Flushing in the Netherlands. However, he made the fatal mistake of giving some letters to a man to deliver to one of his mistresses back in Edinburgh, and Brodie must have been acting suspiciously, so the man gave the letters to the authorities instead. William was able to resume his pursuit in Holland and found his man in Amsterdam, where he was planning to make his escape to the newly independent United States of America. Williamson returned Brodie to Edinburgh for trial. The jury heard how copied keys, a disguise and pistols were found in his house, and his not-so-loyal accomplices Brown and Ainsley turned King's evidence and testified against him, and this, along with the incriminating letters he had written on the run, sealed his fate. In 1788, Brodie and Smith were hanged at the old Tolbooth, adjacent to St Giles Cathedral on the High Street. The building was demolished long ago, but a mosaic of cobblestones remains, located at the entrance to the dreaded prison, known as the Heart of Midlothian, which, to the amusement of tourists, is still spat on for good luck by locals. Brodie drew quite a crowd, estimated to have been up to 40,000, half of the city's entire population, and sadly, including his 10-year-old daughter Cecile. The rope had to be adjusted in length 3 times to get the drop right, but there is a legend that Brodie bribed the hangman to attach the rope to a steel collar and get his body away quickly. Officially, he was buried in an unmarked grave in the north-east corner of the graveyard at a St Cuthbert's Chapel of Ease. But it was rumoured that he managed to escape to Paris, where several people claimed to have seen him. As things were beginning to heat up for the revolution, it would have been easy to remain unnoticed in the chaos, even for someone as flamboyant as William Brodie. Deacon Brodie is pretty famous in Edinburgh. There is a popular pub on the Royal Mile, and he rightly features in all of the Edinburgh ghost tours and night walks. Robert Louis Stevenson certainly knew about Brodie. His family owned a cabinet which they believed had been made by him, and which was in his bedroom as a child. And in 1880 he wrote a play about him, Deacon Brodie, or The Double Life. The play was a complete flop and had little to do with the actual events of Brodie's life. But Stevenson's Brodie was rather more Mr. Hyde-like than the real Brodie, killing one of his housebreaking gang members before being killed himself as he tries to stab a Bow Street runner, a kind of early policeman, to make his escape. So, Deacon Brodie, respected cabinet maker with a penchant for gambling and mistresses, could have been a model for Mr. Hyde. But a second, and in many ways more interesting candidate was Edinburgh-based French teacher Eugène Chantrel, who was hanged for the murder of his wife in 1878, 90 years after Deacon Brodie, and 8 years before Jekyll and Hyde slithered into creation. Stevenson knew Chantrel socially, having met him at a soirée of his old French master, Victor Richon, and they became closer after a chance meeting on the street led to a night drinking in a pub, where they discussed literature and a mutual acquaintance's new translation of Molière. Stevenson attended every day of his trial, shocked by the revelations about his cultured and companionable friend's secret life. Eugène Chantrel was born in 1834 in Nantes, in northwestern France. He studied medicine for a while, but was forced to give up his studies when his ship-owning father went bankrupt. After a stormy and wandering youth, including 9 months in an English jail for an indecent assault on a pupil, he ended up in Edinburgh, where he soon forced himself on a young woman who responded to his advertisement looking for a housekeeper. She was too ashamed to go to the police, so he was able to find work as a French teacher at the private Newington Academy, where he began a relationship with a pupil, Elizabeth Dyer, aged only 15. They married when she hit 16 in 1868, and she gave birth to their first child 2 months later. They set up home together in fashionable George Street, and she had 2 further children. But there was no domestic bliss for Elizabeth. Chantrel drank and frequented the local brothels, and the trial records note, he beat her, kicked her, caned her, cursed her, and more than once she had to invoke the protection of the law. Chantrel sank into habitual intoxication. His teaching jobs faded away, and financial strain added to his wife's other miseries. He frequently threatened to use his medical knowledge to poison her, and in November 1877, just 2 months before her death, he took out a £1,000 life insurance policy against her accidental death. Elizabeth normally enjoyed good health, but on the morning of the 2nd of January 1878, she was found by her maid lying in bed with the bedclothes partially off her, unconscious, awfully pale looking, her eyelids closed, and now and again moaning very heavily. Mr. Carmichael, a general practitioner, was summoned, who found her profoundly and completely unconscious, and there was a strong smell of gas in the room. Sir Henry Littlejohn, the eminent surgeon and forensic scientist, was called for, as the doctor tried to resuscitate her, and she was conveyed to the Royal Infirmary, but she died later without regaining consciousness. A post-mortem examination conducted the next day failed to reveal the cause of death, but the signs of gas poisoning were absent, and traces of opium were found in vomit on her nightgown, and an inspector from the gas company found a freshly and deliberately broken gas pipe. Chantrel was arrested after his wife's funeral 3 days later, where he is said to have shown the most edifying emotion. He pleaded not guilty to her murder, and his trial lasted 4 days. It emerged that when Chantrel had taken out the insurance policy, he had inquired whether accidental death included the partaking of unwholesome dishes such as toasted cheese. Also, that he had purchased 60 grains or nearly 4 grams of opium, enough to drop an elephant, at the same time as taking out the policy, of which no trace could be found. The court also heard from their 10-year-old son, who described how his papa used to call Mama bad names, swear at her, strike her, and make her cry. The jury took just 1 hour and 10 minutes to decide Chantrel was guilty. When he learned of his fate, he declared, "Would that I could place a fuse in the centre of this earth, that I could blow it to pieces, and with it the whole of humanity. I hate them." And later, on the night before his execution, When asked if there was anything he wanted, he said, "Send in 3 bottles of champagne and a whore." Unrepentant, and still blaming his wife, he was hanged the following day in the grounds of Calton Prison, and his body buried in an unmarked grave in the grounds. He was suspected of having committed other murders in France and England, as after his arrival in Edinburgh, more than 4 or 5 had fallen victim to his little supper parties and his favourite dish of toasted cheese and opium. You will not be surprised to learn that there are no pubs in Edinburgh named after Chantrelle. So, now we know how Stevenson came to write Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and we have 2 prime suspects for the dark soul who inspired the author. But how has his Gothic masterpiece been interpreted? What does it all mean? The most obvious interpretation is that it is an examination of the duality of human nature, the struggle between the good and evil in all of us, our civilized, tolerant selves versus our baser, animalistic tendencies. This view has been criticised as too simplistic by those who want to find more complex subtexts in the book about repressed homosexuality, class conflict, even Scotland's relationship with England. But personally, I don't find these analyses particularly convincing. I think there is more mileage in reading it as a kind of cautionary tale about addiction. After all, Jekyll is taking a substance that transforms him from a man adhering to the well-behaved norms of polite Victorian society into a ruffian who indulges in the pleasures and vices of backdoor London, the dark alleyways that would spawn the non-fictional but even more brutal Jack the Ripper just 2 years later. And the fact that Jekyll insists that at the moment I choose I can be rid of Mr. Hyde does sound like the insightless denial that is at the core of so many addicts' behaviour. No different to the alcoholic at the bar who slurringly declares he can give up any time he wants. We often hear the phrase, "Oh, he's got a bit of a Jekyll and Hyde personality," to describe someone who switches suddenly from being pleasant to being distinctly unpleasant. And this is sometimes called a schizophrenic personality change because of the very incorrect view of schizophrenia as a split or dual personality. But please, if you take nothing else away from this video, please remember that schizophrenia is a complex mental illness with multiple symptoms, but it is absolutely not a split personality. There have been all sorts of attempts to psychoanalyse or attach a modern psychiatric label onto Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. But as a forensic psychiatrist who has dealt with some fairly dangerous people over the years, I am cautious about the increasing tendency in society to pathologise choices and behaviour as illness. It wasn't me, it was my bipolar disorder, my ADHD, or my dissociative identity disorder. And whilst all of these disorders, and many more, can affect behaviour, they do not create other identities. And I think there is a risk that people will try to avoid taking responsibility for their actions if we go too far down this path. Robert Louis Stevenson thought deeply about the nature of human existence, about the contentious social and religious debates of his time, and the politics and historical underpinnings of Victorian society. And all of this undoubtedly churned around in his mind to emerge as Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. But I just don't buy the secret subtext idea. I just think he was trying to write a cracking good story as quickly as possible that people would buy to get him out of a financial hole. And I think he did a pretty good job. Thank you for watching. Please let me know your views, and if you have any theories of your own about Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And if you've enjoyed this one, There are plenty of other videos on my channel about writers, artists and historical figures. And remember to subscribe and hit the notifications bell if you haven't already done so. And hopefully I'll see you again soon. Bye for now.